The Philippines Secretary of National Defense Gilbert Teodoro last month announced that the Philippines would change their approach to how his country would confront China in the disputed reefs in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. This was after a Philippine Coast Guard and a Philippine Fishery Development Authority vessel were patrolling in the Scarborough Shoal when they were confronted by 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships that used water cannons against them. The Chinese use of water cannons against Philippine ships in their EEZ were becoming commonplace. However, this was the first time that the Chinese used this tactic on Philippine government ships, and it initiated the call to change tactics. Secretary Teodoro did not state what the change in tactics would be, but a couple of incidents have occurred since the incident at the Scarborough Shoal that might give a hint of some of the new strategies. The first indication of the tactic change was at the Escoda Shoal, where the Philippines discovered what appeared as a Chinese attempt to build an artificial island at this location that was only 75 miles from the Palawan, which is part of the islands that make up the Philippine nation. The Philippines sent out 3 of their Coast Guard vessels, including their largest, to maintain a constant presence in the shoal to ward off the return of the Chinese flotilla that had been operating in the area. The fact that the Philippines sent their largest Coast Guard vessel is telling, because often the Chinese Coast Guard vessels, some of which were converted from Navy warships, are typically of greater displacement compared to the Philippine vessels that they encounter. This has allowed the Chinese to successfully use ramming tactics against the smaller Philippine vessels and take advantage of their greater tonnage. The Philippines are also sending out teams to collect evidence of where the crushed coral that was found in the shoal to attempt to build an artificial island had originated. This will most likely be made public to show the world the Chinese activities in the South China Sea, and possibly to be presented to the International Maritime Court as a complaint to be ruled upon of the Chinese illegal activities in the Philippines EEZ. A new incident occurred this week in the Scarborough Shoal that was a relatively new approach to challenge the Chinese. A Philippine group called Atin Ito, This Is Ours, organized a flotilla to sail out to the disputed shoal. The goal was to conduct a 3-day mission to provide food and diesel to the Philippine fishermen anchored around the shoal. These fishermen are often threatened and harassed by the Chinese Maritime Militia and Chinese Coast Guard, who claim the entire South China Sea as their sovereign territory, and treat the Philippine nationals in the shoal as trespassers. Atin Ito, on Wednesday, May 15th, with 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen organized on 5 wooden bancas, set sail to the Scarborough Shoal, and was escorted by 100 Philippine fishing boats. Not all fishing boats made the full journey. The flotilla's announced intent was to provide supplies to the Philippine fishermen around the shoal, but the true goal was a publicized event to challenge the Chinese claims in the Philippine EEZ. Some of the volunteers on board the boats were there to film and catalog the event. A small advance team from the Philippine group succeeded in entering the Scarborough Shoal and was able to deliver supplies that were to be distributed to 36 Philippine fishing boats with 144 fishermen. The successful delivery of the provisions was twofold, in that it was a humanitarian gesture to support the Philippine fishermen that faced daily harassment from the Chinese, but also that it was able to breach the Chinese blockade around the shoal. The Chinese had deployed 1 Navy ship, Plan, 8 Coast Guard ships, and 34 maritime militia ship around the shoal, so it was a serious attempt by China to block access. The group gave credit for their successful mission to their ingenuity and bravery to break through the Chinese blockade. The main part of the flotilla did not attempt to land in the Scarborough Shoal due to the heavy Chinese presence, but were able to document the Chinese presence and reaction. The Philippine government was not involved in the operation, but the Philippine Coast Guard did escort the flotilla to monitor Chinese activities along with a Coast Guard aircraft with the official purpose of protecting Philippine civilians from Chinese reactions. The Chinese threatened the main flotilla, so it chose not to challenge the Chinese blocking of the shoal. The Chinese government did react to the incursion by authorizing its Coast Guard to arrest any foreigners trespassing in its claimed territorial waters. But this was issued after the Philippine group had successfully breached the Chinese line. No attempted arrests were made after the incident, and was more of a threat to discourage future returns of Philippine civilians. The large presence of Chinese ships in the region was due to the announced mission of Atin Ito to sail to the Scarborough Shoal and was not claimed to be a blockade. The interpretation and use of blockade is being loosely used. The blockage of Scarborough Shoal is more of a technicality, as any attempt to enter the shoal is blocked by the Chinese, and is in effect really a blockade. China also maintains a constant presence in the region to harass Philippine ships with the intent to make them leave and deny them access to the fishery in and around the shoal. The term blockade is being loosely interpreted differently by both sides. The Philippines called it a blockade because the number of ships used to block its ability to get to the shoal, and the Chinese avoid the term altogether. A blockade is an act of war according to the 1856 Paris Declaration respecting maritime law and Articles 1 through 22 of the 1909 London Declaration concerning the laws of naval war. But no power in the region is willing to challenge China to go to war over an uninhabited shoal in the EEZ, even if they call it a blockade and it acts as a de facto blockade. This would be approached differently if it was in blocking territorial waters and the extended EEZ. This Chinese are also using the maritime militia to do most of the blocking and harassing, and the Chinese claim they are civilians and not military and outside of government control. This is another technicality by the Chinese, since the militia takes their direction from various levels of the Chinese Communist Party. The actions of Atan Ito are a relatively new tactic by the Philippines and had been used one time before, successfully, in late 2023. What the Atan Ito is performing is the same function that the Chinese maritime militia performs, and that is maritime gray zone tactics. Gray zone tactics are tactics between war and peace, and are used to create conditions favorable to one side. The use of these tactics by China is to deploy its non-military forces to block freedom of navigation, intimidate or coerce foreign elements in the South China Sea. The intent is to ward off any smaller power from reacting to the presence of the groups conducting the tactics to avoid an escalation or try to encourage an escalation, so the larger power can justify using military force to protect its citizens. The Atan Ito is a Philippine response to the gray zone tactics of China with a gray zone tactic of its own. The Atan Ito put itself in harm's way, knowing that any overreaction by the Chinese that caused the death of a Philippine citizen would be a serious escalation. In mid-April, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. stated that any death of a Filipino citizen could trigger the U.S. Defense Pact with the Philippines. The statement was in the context of the death of a Filipino serviceman, but was stated after Chinese Coast Guard used water cannons against a civilian ship that was attempting a resupply mission to the Second Thomas Shoal that resulted in the injury of 3 Philippine Navy sailors aboard the civilian ship. The open question is if the statement was only about servicemen or to any Philippine citizen. The Philippine Coast Guard was observing Atan Ito from the sea and the air with the stated goal to protect its citizens. Is the intent to challenge China to force it to back down to avoid a situation that could kill a Philippine citizen and risk an escalation that would not only be with the Philippines but also the US and possibly Japan? It is unclear if the use of Atan Ito to break the Chinese attempts to block access to the disputed waters is the tactic change that Secretary Teodoro was referencing, or even if it will be used again. It is a challenge by the Philippines not to give up its rights to the disputed shoals in the West Philippine Sea, the name of the area that is in the South China Sea that is part of the Philippine EEZ. So the Philippines are not simply giving up their claims by abandoning the region to China. It is a real challenge to China because if it acts aggressively against unarmed civilians in light boats, that most likely would not stand up to a water cannon assault. It could kill or seriously injure a Philippine national. If that happens, it risks triggering a showdown with the US. It would be in a region that China would not want to fight a naval war, so the escalation cycle continues to press the Chinese on their illegal claims.